In the last lecture, we examined the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and some of the factors that pushed Europe and then much of the world into a state of war. The questions that many have about the outbreak of the war is why the death of this man, a man, as I said, who few liked, and in many cases few seem to be concerned about, could cause such a great conflagration. Surely the death of one man could not be worth so many millions, who would soon follow him to the grave. Since the war, of course, a great deal of ink has been spilled about the causes of struggle, and no historian could possibly hope to read all of the works on the First World War in a lifetime. Winston Churchill said there was no part of the Great War that compares with its opening. And if one is to understand that opening, it requires examining the long-term and short-term causes of the war. And these causes were wide-ranging. I think it's probably possible that we could teach an entire class on the causes of World War I that could last years rather than months. But we don't have that luxury. We have, in this case, just under about 2 hours. So we need to go back to the middle of the 19th century and also ask some questions about the 19th century as a whole. First and foremost, when we are looking at the 19th century, we're looking at a very progressive century, one that's built on the Enlightenment. And Lawrence Lefort, in his book, The Long Fuse, addresses this question of Europe at the end of the 19th century. And in this quote, I think he hits on some important things that we, again, need to keep in mind. First, this idea of progress and enlightenment, that Europe was moving towards, as he points out, humanity and reason, giving up the old and moving on to something new that might be peaceful and usefully absorbed into the new. They understood that the means to untold affluence were at hand. They believed that with it, the planet might ultimately produce a civilization of perpetual peace and progress, guided by the light of exact knowledge that was rapidly being revealed to mankind. By the sun of what was vaguely called science, all things were to be illuminated. Secrets of the universe made known, superstition dispelled, the nature of human existence revealed, the means to a richer and wiser world fashioned. So the 19th century was, in a sense, a bright and illuminating age, but yet, in a sense, it ends with this great war. And so what we want to do then is begin to explore what led to the outbreak. The best way to start is with a general overview of the European state system in the mid to late 19th century. The 19th century represented a very dynamic period in European history. As a whole, the continent had settled down to a fairly peaceful existence, as Lefort points out. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 had settled the problems caused by the Napoleonic War. The French, who had conquered much of Central Europe, had now been vanquished. Their borders had been redrawn to those of 1792. And unlike the Germans and the Austrians after the First World War, the French had been allowed to participate in the Congress of Vienna. The major powers, Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, remained wary of revolution. But with Louis XVIII and later the reactionary Charles X restored to the throne of France, there was little indication that France would return to its revolutionary past. From 1815 to 1853, the so-called Congress system kept the peace in Europe. There was no general European war, and while there were two revolutions, the 1830 and 1848 revolutions, to all intents and purposes, Europe was free from war until the outbreak of the Crimean War in 1853. That war was first to pit members of the Congress system against one another. fought over fears of Russia's growing influence in the Middle East. The British, French, Sardinians, and Ottoman Empire waged a struggle that was fought in the Black Sea, the Baltic, against the Tsarist regime of Nicholas I. That war could hardly be described as a general European struggle on the par with previous wars. It tended to be isolated in the area of the Crimean Peninsula, their corner of the map in the Black Sea, and in the Baltic Sea. There, the Western powers proved victorious, though the victory brought little fruits beyond the British and the French solidifying their positions in the Middle East at the expense of the Russians. By mid-century, then, the European powers were observing significant shifts in Central and Southern Europe, driven by what many believed to be the major influence on the 1914 war, that being nationalism. National movements were fueled by the French Revolution, and we will see this first in the unification of Italy and then Germany. Italian unification was all but complete by 1860, with the process finalized in 1871 when French troops left Rome. Italia Irredentia, Italy Unredeemed, were the areas that you see in red there in the map. The Trentino, the Tyrol, the Trieste, and the Dalmatian coast. These would remain in Austrian hands, but serve as fuel for the nationalist anger against their northern neighbors in 1915. Italy was more or less the weakest of the European powers that would enter the war in the case of Italy, 1915. Ruled by a monarch, Victor Emmanuel I, the Italians had probably the weakest economy of the major European states. And she also had the smallest empire as well, with just a small part of the Libyan coast. She attempted to conquer Ethiopia in 1895-96, but that also it failed. In 1914, nationalists began to urge their fellow Italians to leave the Triple Alliance and to join the Entente as a means of winning back what the Italians believed was rightfully theirs. But the nationalist sentiment then fueled the desire by the Italians to eventually join with the Triple Alliance, as we'll talk about a little later in the lecture, and that would bring them into the war in 1915. In Germany, or the area of Central Europe, which was at that time not Germany proper, but in 1864, Prussia went to war with Denmark over the northern provinces of Schleswig-Holstein, and 2 years later, the great Prussian Prime Minister, Otto von Bismarck, manufactured a crisis with his former ally Austria. This led to the Austro-Prussian War of 1866. The Prussians won the war, handily defeating the Austrians at the Battle of Königgrätz in July of 1866. Prussian troops arrived on the Austrian border by railway, and they were better trained and better equipped than their Austrian counterparts, though they were fewer in number. On the day, the Austrians had an army of 240,000 men, the Prussians 124,000. But losses as a result of the long battle were a harbinger of things to come, with 40,000 men killed in total. In 1870, under rather suspect pretenses, Bismarck turned his attention towards France in the last war of unification. The surrounding of the French army and the capitulation, along with Emperor Napoleon II at the Battle of Sedan in September 1870, just 5 weeks after the fighting started, would lead to the establishment of the German state. Kaiser Wilhelm I was proclaimed emperor in the Palace of Versailles. The speed of the Prussian victory would also shape the military strategy in the coming quarter century and influence both the German and French decisions to go to war in 1914. The fruits of victory for Germany, along with unification, were the French provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, as well as dominance of Central Europe, which for many French men and women was too much to bear. They yearned for a return of what were known as the Lost Provinces, and the statue of to Strasbourg in the Place de la Concorde was draped in black crepe until the beginning of the war. When the war broke out in 1914, the mourning cloth was replaced by the French tricolor. Now, I do not wish to overemphasize the French desire to regain the provinces at such a high cost as would come with the outbreak of World War I. By 1914, it had been 40 years since the Franco-Prussian War, and historians are now arguing that that time had softened attitudes of revenge towards Germany in the efforts to gain the lost provinces. The older generation could remember the loss, and they may have been more bellicose, but the younger generation had grown up not really knowing the pain of the loss that occurred back in 1871. But 1871 then marks an important point in European history, for it represents the point in which all of the participants of World War I are actually sort of in place. France, defeated and denuded of its two provinces, remained a powerful imperial entity. Germany now stood astride in Central Europe. Austria, following the Ausgleich of 1867, the creation of the dual monarchy with Austria and Hungary, with the Hungarians getting equal billing, and Franz Joseph, who we've already met, in power, these states then began to form up into alliances. Russia remained an autocracy under the watchful eye of the Tsars, Alexander II, Alexander III, and finally the last Tsar, Nicholas II. In Russia, the serfs had been freed in 1861, but the country remained predominantly rural, and its intelligentsia and middle class were coming into their own in the 1870s and 1830s. Its industrial working class was slow to develop, and that would begin to take more shape in the 1890s and early in the 1900s. The other major power, the Ottoman Empire, was slowly losing its great power status and was known by this time as the sick man of Europe. The Sultanate, lavishly housed behind the gates of the Sublime Porte, fiddled while the empire crumbled. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877, with the Russians aided by their Slavic allies in the Balkans, was able to reestablish its control over the Black Sea that it had lost during the Crimean War. What followed before the outbreak of the First World War would be two Balkan Wars, the first fought in 1912 and the second in 1913. Those paved the way for the continental power blocks to be drawn into the Balkans, and thus paving the way for the outbreak of World War I. The Italian invasion of Libya, an Ottoman territory, in 1911 had set the wheels of change in motion there as well, spurring on populations of the Balkans to wage their war against their Ottoman masters. It's interesting to note that the Germans and Austrians believed that the Italian invasion would cause trouble in the Balkans, and they were correct. This is why they did not back Italy's efforts in Libya. In the First Balkan War, Serbia allied with Bulgaria, aided by the Greeks and Montenegrins, again to drive the Ottomans from Europe proper. The war began in October of 1912 and was quickly over, with the Ottomans on the losing end. So successful were the Balkan states that their armies came within 30 miles of Constantinople. No sooner had the Balkan states been victorious, they, notably Serbia and Bulgaria, turned on each other, indicating, of course, the volatility of the area known as the powder keg of Europe. The Second Balkan War was, at its heart, a Serbian-Bulgarian struggle over Macedonia. The Greeks, Romanians, and Turks joined to fight Bulgaria, which lost most of the territory it had acquired in the First War, as the maps indicate. So on the eve of the First World War, of course, the Balkans was a very tense situation, and again, hence the name, the powder keg of Europe. it was in many cases waiting to explode, and the death of Archduke Franz Ferdinand set the fuse. Now, let's turn our attention to Britain. During the 19th century, then, Britain remained aloof from continental politics for the most part, concentrating on building its vast empire, an empire, of course, in which the sun never set. The island nation remained protected by its fleet, which was twice the size and then some of any of the other major European or world powers at the time. For much of the last half of the 19th century, Britain remained in what was described as splendid isolation, content to grow rich from the spoils of the combined forces of industrialization and empire. She didn't ally herself with either the Prussians or, God forbid, the French in their respective struggles, but again remained outside of these continental European debates. Britain's little wars, as they're sometimes referred to, were colonial ones, fought against the Zulu and the Ashanti in southern Africa, and the Afghans in Central Asia in the 1870s. Much of the fighting was done by Britain's small but highly professional army, the bulk of which was stationed in India until 1899, when the Boer War broke out in South Africa. The Boers, Dutch-German farmers, used modern weaponry, trench warfare, barbed wire, and fast-moving cavalry, and they gave the British a very good fight. The Boer War, which the British eventually won, provided ample evidence that even a group of amateur soldiers dug in and using modern weapons could decimate densely packed columns of trained men, making life for the attacker much more difficult than that for the defender. The message, however, was lost owing to the belief that colonial wars were hardly the same as continental wars. This is interesting because many of the World War I British generals, including Douglas Haig, served in South Africa. If Britain had a European political concern at the turn of the century, it was much closer to home, in Ireland. In the summer of 1914, the war the English were concerned with was the one that could possibly break out in their colony next door. The call for Irish Home Rule had split Ireland. The 6 predominantly Protestant northern counties in Ulster did not wish to be included in a Home Rule agreement with the southern Irish. As 1914 approached, the two sides were beginning to arm, and efforts to disarm them led to the so-called Kerrar Mutiny, where Protestant army officers in Ireland, including John French, who would lead the British Expeditionary Force into France, refused to disarm their co-religionists in Northern Ireland, leading French and others to step down rather than carry out their government's wishes. So each of the major powers in Europe had their own concerns, military and political and economic. It didn't necessarily mean that they were going to go to war against each other. And again, as we'll begin to think about this in more detail, war did not necessarily seem inevitable, or at least a world war did not seem inevitable as we entered into the 20th century. The last quarter of the 19th century, then, saw the destruction of the old Congress system, which to all intents and purposes had kept the peace for much of the century. The new political arrangements on the European continent were not only being forged by nationalism, but also by economic and imperial relationships. What is forged, however, are two alliances that many suggest alongside nationalism were the primary reasons for the outbreak of the First World War. Now, it's highly unlikely that the outbreak of the war was monocausal, but there are those who believe that the alliance system should be placed front and center, and that because it was in place, it created the house of cards that collapsed in the summer of 1914. Had the alliance system not been in place, there are some who believe that the war would have simply been a third Balkan War, a much more localized Balkan conflict rather than a European and then a global struggle. These are the two sides then, and they should be committed to memory because, again, we'll be coming back to them throughout the course. The Triple Alliance comprised of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and initially Italy, but Italy will drop out in 1915 and join the Entente. The Ottoman Empire will join in 1914. The Triple Entente, a looser kind of alliance, if we can even use the term alliance, comprised of Britain, France, and Russia. The alliances began to take shape soon after German unification. After the victory in the Franco-Prussian War, Bismarck sought to build a working relationship with his former foe, Austria-Hungary, and, interestingly enough, with the Russians. While they are going to be part of the Entente, initially they were part of what was known as the Drei Kaiser Bund, the three Kaiser or three kings agreement, a tripartite alliance system between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia that was established in 1873. This was meant to ward off an attempt by France to regain the lost provinces. The Dreikaiserbund was firmed up in 1881, renewed in 1884, but finally crumbled in 1887. And the problem was over the Balkans, that part of the world that we keep returning to. The Dreikaiserbund had no stipulation about military alliances per se. However, it did state that if one power went to war with a state not covered by the alliance, in this case France, the others would maintain friendly neutrality. Austria-Hungary, however, had established a stronger military alliance with Germany as part of what is known as the Dual Alliance, established in 1879. This becomes the foundation for the Triple Alliance, and its intentions were directed east rather than west. The Dual Alliance protected Germany and Austria against an attack from Russia. In the case of war with France, the other, whether it be Austria or Germany, was meant to remain neutral. Underlying this treaty is the degree of distrust within the Dreikaiserbund itself. The final member of the Triple Alliance was Italy, at this time at least. The Italians joined in 1882, a move that Bismarck believed would further isolate France. The Italians never seemed to be fully on board. While they pledged a certain degree of allegiance to Germany, who would protect the Italians from a possible French invasion, the Italians would sign a separate secret agreement with the French in 1900 over spheres of influence in northern Africa. And again, in the event of war between France and Germany, the Italians pledged to be neutral. The nature of these secret agreements then further complicated the already complex international relationships that I've been talking about to this point, and it gives credence to the notion of a kind of international anarchy that historians talk about in the years leading up to the outbreak of the First World War. The breakdown of the Dreikaiserbund may well have been another harbinger of war in 1914. The Austrians were eager to impose themselves on the Balkans, especially Bosnia-Herzegovina, after the Russo-Turkish War and the slow withdrawal of the Ottomans from the region. Russia, too, felt it should maintain its influence in southern Europe, and it even wished to take Constantinople and to reestablish the Orthodox faith in that city. The Germans had actually planned to free themselves from the partnership with Russia, owing to the growing differences that existed between the two countries. And one of the readings from the Nyberg Reader will discuss this. The decision by the Russians to pull out of the Dreikaiserbund left Moscow looking for a new partner in Europe, and the only possible suitor was France. And in many respects, this was a truly unlikely mix. Previous history courses might very well have taught you that in 1812, the Russian revolutionary armies under Napoleon had invaded Russia, bringing revolutionary ideology to Moscow. Moscow had been burned, but the Grand Army was eventually vanquished, and afterwards the Tsarist regimes did all they could to keep the French revolutionary ideas from infecting the Russian intelligentsia and the common folk. The Russians were naturally coy at first, but secret negotiations were entered into in 1891, and in 1894, autocratic Russia allied itself with Republican France. On the surface, the Franco-Russian agreement was defensive, but that is not how the Germans saw it. With Germany in the center of Europe, they now saw their old foes France on their western border and the vast hordes of the Russian army positioned in the east. French loans to the Russian government supported industrial and military growth, and that worried the German Foreign Office. So, in 1894, the foundation pillars of the alliance system were now in place. The dual alliance of Germany and Austria-Hungary against the dual alliance of France and Russia. The next piece of the puzzle was Britain, who was slowly but surely coming out of splendid isolation. If Germany and France had a rivalry, it was nothing, of course, in comparison with that of Britain and France. Britain and France had been at each other's throats since the Middle Ages, and as their empires grew, it seemed only a matter of time before war would break out between them. That almost happened in 1898, the village of Fashoda on the Upper Nile in Africa, a region we now know as South Sudan. The Fashoda crisis, for that is what it was, almost led to war between the two countries, but cooler heads prevailed and war was eventually averted. But at the turn of the century, it did not seem likely that Britain and France would find themselves coming to any kind of agreement because of their imperial interests around the world that always seemed to be slightly at odds with one another. But the decision to come to a closer kind of agreement was the result of a number of factors, including the business community calling for closer ties and hope that colonial differences could be overcome through negotiation rather through war. It was not just in Africa, but also in the Middle East and in China that France and Britain sought to reach accords for the sake of commercial interests. A successful visit from King Edward VII to Paris in 1903 has long been seen as the icing on the cake. The way that royal visits helped to win over Canadians, Australians, and even Americans in the modern day was accomplished by Edward, who won over the French people with his charm and wit, and then made it easier for politicians to forge the so-called Entente Cordiale in 1904. Now, this was no binding military agreement as part of the Entente. In many respects, it was simply all about colonial interest and spheres of influence around the world, particularly Britain and Egypt, France and Morocco and North Africa, and also elsewhere. The goal then was to maintain the status quo and maintain order in the world, where the French and the British empires could then be further extended if necessary. Later on, as tensions grew between the alliance systems, Britain and France did undertake military talks, but these were at a fairly basic level. It's important to keep in mind that the Entente was a looser kind of alliance, and that if the French did decide to go to war against Germany, it did not necessarily mean that the British would come to their aid. But again, we'll come back to this in much more detail when we talk about the outbreak of the war in the next lecture. The agreement between Russia and Britain hinged on spheres of influence in Persia. Russia had suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of the Japanese in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05, and in 1905 she'd suffered her first revolution, which saw the introduction of some liberal reforms in Russia as a result of the October Manifesto signed by Tsar Nicholas II. Eager to recover from these setbacks and wary of the growing influence of Germany as an economic and political power within Central Europe, Russia wanted to reconfigure her foreign policy arrangements. to ease pressures along her borders. Now, relations between Britain and Russia were tense, to say the least. The incident you see here on the slide, the Dogger Bank incident, had seen a low point in Anglo-Russian relations. The Russian fleet set sail from its ports in the Baltic, sailing through the British Channel, and attacked British fishing trawlers in the Channel, believing them to be Japanese attack boats. This almost brought the two countries to war, but once again, cooler heads did prevail. By 1907, then, two countries had reached sort of tentative agreement over the situation in Persia. That agreement looked like the one you see on the map here. Russia would control the northern part in the area in blue. A neutral section would divide the two, and Britain would have influence in the lower area, which again would be to help them protect the jewel in their crown, India. So here again, on paper, the Entente was neither political or military, and it was in no way consultative as well. But by 1907, then, a loose kind of connection had been drawn between France, Russia, and Britain. And again, this was not a hard and fast alliance, but it was one that would begin to solidify that side against that of the Central Powers. So many of the political arrangements that were taking place between once European powers began to use the Maxim gun, like you see here, the machine gun, introduced in the 1890s, the peoples of Africa and Asia stood much less chance of victory in these wars. The introduction of the Maxim gun, which could fire 500 rounds per minute, a product of the Industrial Revolution, changed dramatically the relationship those who had the technology and those who did not. In fact, a British poet wrote the now famous quote, "Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun, and they have not." So as I mentioned, the race for colonies brought about a variety of tensions between Britain and France in the Upper Nile in 1898. Germany was a late starter where colonies were concerned. Bismarck had no real interest in clashing with Britain, and he tended to focus much of his attention on continental political matters. But that began to change in 1888, and the reason for that is the arrival of the Kaiser. Kaiser Wilhelm II was an interesting figure to say the least. Generally considered a warm individual who could be generous when he wanted to be, but also considered very emotional and unpredictable. In fact, one of his ideas was actually during the war to invade America, something that would have proved very, very difficult for the Germans at the time. Wilhelm suffered from an inferiority complex, particularly when it came to his British cousins. He had a withered left arm, and this appears to have played some role in his feelings of inferiority. But the Kaiser saw himself as a figure who could bind together the German people. He considered himself the people's Kaiser. And while he did not rule unconstitutionally, he did allow his ministers and his general staff to run the country and the army. He did try to impose his views on the construction of foreign and internal policy at times. He was, some suggest, a kind of loose cannon. In 1890, he took one of his most important steps. He dismissed Bismarck, the so-called dropping of the pilot, as the cartoon suggests. With the end of the Bismarckian era, Wilhelm set a new course that differed from that of the Iron Chancellor. Wilhelm wished Germany to become a world power, to compete for colonies in Africa and Asia. to engage in what was known as Weltpolitik, which was the securing of colonies, raw materials, and with it prestige. But that meant competition with his English cousin Edward VII, whose navy was the largest in the world and whose empires, of course, the sun never set. Wilhelm had an ally in his quest to establish Germany as a world power, that being Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz. Remember Tirpitz from the Rose Garden meeting with Franz Ferdinand. Despite the fact that Germany was a land power, Wilhelm and Tirpitz argued that Germany could only engage in Weltpolitik if they had a navy, which is exactly what they sought to construct. Now, I'll return to the naval arms race a little later, but Wilhelm's attempt to obtain an empire was hampered by his mercurial personality and the most undiplomatic of diplomatic skills. The most serious problems centered on the Moroccan crises of 1905 and 1911, and this arose out of Germany's influence, or attempt to influence, matters in France's colonial sphere of influence on the North African coast. The conflict revolved around pride and prestige rather than around what one would consider truly serious matters. France simply did not want Germany meddling in affairs in this part of the world. The Franco-German disputes that marked the First and Second Moroccan crises of 1905 and 1911 almost ended in a major war between the two powers. Wilhelm's saber-rattling and his gunboat diplomacy did much to stir animosity between the two countries, but it also pushed Britain and France closer together. Wilhelm simply wanted to be included. He wanted to have his empire alongside England and France, but this might very well cause some problems. And if Wilhelm could not have what France and Britain had, he could at least undermine their position in the world. He was a vocal supporter of the Boer farmers against the British and sent the very famous Kruger telegram congratulating the Boer president on his success in resisting the British raid on the Transvaal. He also sent the Boers weapons and once again showed that the Kaiser was not afraid to take sides in imperial disputes, and doing so heightened rather than eased tensions between the great powers. All of the great powers were also involved in efforts to carve up China into spheres of influence, as this famous cartoon illustrates. In 1900, the Boxer Rebellion broke out in China, an anti-European campaign that foreign powers used as a pretext to further carve up the country. All of the complex entanglements in Europe were then imposed upon China, where Britain and Germany actually worked together against the Russians. The Japanese also took an active role in the imperial machinations in China and established themselves as a great power in the region at the same time. This led to their war with Russia over Port Arthur and Manchuria, marked by the Japanese naval victory at the Battle of Tsushima Straits in 1905. The naval victory is significant, but the land battles were equally important, as they saw the use of many tactics and technologies that would be used in the First World War. Nearly 500,000 men fought at the Battle of Mukden in 1905 during the Russo-Japanese War. And as this picture suggests, they employed trench warfare, heavy artillery, and machine guns. Over 3 weeks of fighting, the Russians lost 90,000 men. The implication of these wars should have been understood, but suffice it to say, they were not. And again, I'll talk about the reasons for that a little later. Eventually, the urge to colonize did subside, and to all intents and purposes, by 1910, the European powers began to turn inward, to strengthen ties with their neighbors, and to improve their security, their training, and building up of their armies and navies. Military forces that seemed to be preparing for the next war, as you'll read about in the Nyberg book.